Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Should I Start a Podcast? I'm Ronsley, and if this is the first time you're joining me, this is a live recording of the podcast. If you want the edited version, go to Should I Start a Podcast? You'll find it on all your podcast platforms. But today, I have a treat for you. I have Dr. Sherry Walling in the house, and she is all sorts of amazing. We're going to talk about her new book. We're going to talk about her podcast. We're going to talk about her journey as a podcaster, putting her voice out there, talking about things that really, really are hard to talk about and how she gets around doing that. I'm also going to talk about a mistake that we make as business owners when we have a podcast, and that is forgetting to tag our ID3 tags in our MP3 files. So hang around for that. And also, if you're a business owner podcaster and you have a case study on how a how a podcast is like hindered or grown your business or helped your business grow, I'd love to hear that and feature you on the show. So send me a DM, and I would love to see what you've been doing with your podcast. Anyway, today's guest, Dr. Sherry Walling, she hosts a bunch of podcasts. The one that I love is ZenFounder, and it's an amazing show for entrepreneurs, especially ones that know that the mind is such an important part of their output, I suppose, and how they show up. And she's now the host of Mind Curious, a podcast exploring psychedelics, which is really cool. And I want to talk to her about that. But I also want to talk to her about her new book, which I got just before I left the US. It's called Touching Two Worlds. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sherry Walling. How are you, Sherry?
Hey, Ronsley, I am delighted to be in conversation with you. Thanks for having me.
So cool. Thank you for indulging me in my experiments. I am constantly finding ways to have these conversations in situations that allows me to ask some questions that I don't know how it's going to start off before the conversation, and I kind of allow myself to kind of be in this moment and be present, which is actually a treat for me. So thank you for being here. Let's talk about your journey as a podcaster. What was it like when you first started? Um, has that changed in the way you express yourself? Has the topics changed? Just if you could give us a brief overview of your life as a podcaster, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, my life as a podcaster. I began a podcast called Parenting Reimagined, probably about 10 years ago. So it was a little bit of an earlier on podcast, but I was really in the midst of my own journey. I was a university professor. I had already had my PhD, gotten my PhD, and I just had my second child. And I felt a little bit lost in my world of being a very sort of high functioning, high level professional and also having very young children.
Mhm.
And so I did a podcast where I interviewed parents all about their different sort of experiences of transformation related to parenting. And honestly, it was very much for me. It was conversations I wanted to have. But it really helped me to understand kind of the framework of podcasting. It was sort of a trial run, I should say.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, I started the podcast called ZenFounder, which was really based in my perceived need for there to be more thoughtful conversations about mental health within the entrepreneurial community.
Mm.
So I originally started it with my husband, Rob, who was an entrepreneur. So he's the entrepreneur, tech entrepreneur, and I'm the clinical psychologist. And together we, exchange conversation around entrepreneurship and mental health.
Yeah.
And that has been going strong for, I guess we're probably around 350 episodes these days.
Yeah, yeah. And when you think of that journey as when you started off, how has Zen Founder changed since episode one?
Yeah, it changed a lot. I mean, one of the most like practical changes is that it started as a conversation between my husband Rob and I with these sort of two different perspectives in dialogue. And I think we did that for about 100 episodes. And then I feel like I wanted to take the podcast in a different direction. And so he retired from the podcast and I took it on. And it's also changed a lot thematically. Like I think it started as these very like quick tips and tactics to help with mental health. And we still do some of those episodes, but I've really found it like more satisfying to do a deeper dive into more complicated topics.
Yeah.
So I would say the themes of the podcast have matured over time.
So, did you feel like those initial conversations allowed you to refine your thoughts, your arguments, and then put them together in a way that you wanted to tackle, like, I suppose, um, more complicated topics, if for the lack of another way to explain that?
Yeah, I think I was learning how to podcast,
Mm.
right? Learning to use my voice in that way, learning what I felt comfortable disclosing more publicly in that domain, learning what was sticky for people, what was interesting. And so the whole process is a process of elimination and also a process of my own maturing with the modality.
So, let's talk about that maturing through the modality. I love how you put that because I feel, I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years. That's crazy because Facebook just
Yeah.
reminded me that the other day. And I've seen a lot of, I mean, it's a very personal thing to put your voice out there. And this is something I'd love to chat with you about today is like when you do care about something, how do you remove all the other stuff to just get the reps in so that you're kind of at least getting the reps in as opposed to getting it perfect all the time, and is there a way to kind of change perspective in those moments?
There's this little video by Ira Glass, who's the host of one of my favorite radio shows, This American Life. And he, in this video, talks about how in the beginning there's a gap between your taste as a creator and your ability as the creator. So for a while, you're going to just make a lot of stuff that's not as good as your taste, right? That you don't particularly love because you're putting in the reps, as you say. And you're also going to spend a lot of time editing and tinkering and adjusting and trying to perfect. And that does get easier over time. I also think that for me, I came to the world of podcasting as an academic. I literally was a college professor. And when I resigned from my teaching job, I really dove deeply into podcasting. And so I think I started as sort of this teacher, like information disseminator. And although that's valuable, I really learned that that wasn't what really mattered to my audience. And so now I see myself more as a storyteller and as someone who is mindful of research and science, but really putting my heart and my personal experience more into the forefront of the stories that I tell in a way that allows for deeper connection.
So there are a few things that you mentioned in there. One of them is being in academia, being an academic, and then getting into this world where anything works. What has that been like for you? What is that transition like for you?
Well, I stick to my academic chops in the sense that I do think it's important that information go through some kind of filter, right? One of the dangers of podcasting, one of the downsides is that anybody with a mic can become an influencer or anybody with a microphone can be passed off as an expert. And sometimes that's really damaging. And so I think in my work, I do try to adhere to some of the techniques of science, which things like cite your sources and make sure that ideas that you're presenting that maybe there's more than one way to think about it, or you're giving a sense of where that knowledge or research comes from.
Yeah.
So that's still important to me as for an academic in recovery.
And so it should be. I mean, that's the reason I asked is because there is so much information out there. And I was back in India, in Goa, seeing my parents go through WhatsApp every morning with fake news that people have sent them, which and getting worked up about it and not knowing the difference between what is real news and what has just been sent to them. So I feel like you taught me something really amazing, and I don't know whether you even know that you did it. When Black Lives Matter happened 2 years ago, it feels like it was just the other day. Um, I asked you about whether you had any thoughts on what you wanted to say about it, and I think you said to me, "There's sometimes that you're not supposed to say anything, and you're just supposed to just sit and listen." And I mean, I think you just said that in passing, but I really took that on because I feel like in today's world, when something happens, it's almost like a knee jerk reaction that we've got to respond in some way. And sometimes we just don't need to respond. And I wonder whether that happens to you, and when was the last time that happened?
I really relate to that weight of feeling like maybe because you've been public about a certain topic, that anything subsequent to that topic, you feel like you have to weigh in on. But I do think there's wisdom in making sure you're only speaking when you really have something thoughtful to say, like not just chiming in unless your contribution is something that you're proud of and that's meaningful to you. Um, I'm really thoughtful about that. I think so as a mental health practitioner, whenever there's a someone dies by suicide or by overdose in the news, I think people will sometimes be like, "Are you going to say anything, or are you going to comment on that?" And I mean, often these are individual lives lost in a very tragic way, and I don't know the humans. Like I don't have some wonderful insight into why a particular rock star may have died in a certain way. And so I have to really go through my own integrity about whether I have something really to contribute or whether I would just be a talking head that sort of, I guess, succumbing to the pressure of other people to make some noise about a certain topic.
Yeah, and I think I think they call it newsjacking these days, where you kind of like
Mm.
find something topical and use it to get attention to what you do, and unfortunately, again, because these lines are being we don't know what these lines are. I mean, in the social media world, we're still trying to figure the social world out, and sometimes people take situations in their life and use it for really good purposes, like Touching Two Worlds, which, my God, what a book. I mean, I'm only halfway through, and I have post-it notes everywhere. And what I'd love to first talk about is when you're writing Touching Two Worlds, it's how did you allow something so difficult to pass through you? Like, how did you not let the weight of what you were going through, which is really outlined, and I can feel what you were going through when I read it.
Mm.
How did you let that not get in the way, and how did you let that come through you, and what was your process of expression like?
Yeah. And just to give listeners context, Touching Two Worlds is a memoir, and it's also kind of a psychological analysis that was written really about my experience of losing my father to cancer and my brother to suicide in a really within 6 months of each other, so in a tight timeline. And so I had this sort of couple year period of my life where my life was very much about their sickness and their illness and their need for care and support. And then it was very much about grief after they died. And Ronsley, the honest truth is that this book was a book that wanted to be written, and I was kind of like the vessel. I mean, it was written at like 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. It was written on airplanes. It was written here and there whenever I had a thought or a question that was bothering me and I felt like I needed to record it somewhere. So the book is it's very personal. It's very intimate to my experience. But it's gone through these different iterations of being something that I wanted to give to other people. So, I think of like, somebody like you where it's like I'm leaving you a little note like dear Ronsley, I'm sorry to tell you that someday you'll lose people that you love. I hope that doesn't happen, but it will. And in the event that it does, here's the things that I learned from my own experience, and I've just written them down for you.
Mm.
And so that's sort of the tone of the book.
It's so beautifully written. I mean, it's like nothing I've read before in terms of how it's presented and how you've managed to present some of the topics in here. How did you organize these thoughts, or were they just random at the start, and then later when there was stuff coming together, that's when you started to organize them? What was that process like?
Yeah, the book, I guess the simplest iteration or the simplest beginning point was really it was sort of my journal. There were also a few of the essays that were taken from Facebook posts, which I feel a little bit embarrassed to admit, but when I was in the middle of these losses, especially my dad's loss, because he had been very public about his experience with cancer. And so I was writing as well about my experience with his cancer. And we were sharing that with our various, family members and friends and communities. And so um, I collected all of these journal entries and all of these Facebook posts. And then I went back through his essays on Caring Bridge and other places that he had written about his losses. And there wasn't any great magic to organizing it, except that I knew that I wanted to reflect on my dad's experience, on my brother's experience, somewhat separately, and then to think about the two losses in tension with each other or I guess together. A lot of people experience what we call like cumulative loss, where they've lost one or more people, especially in light of the pandemic. A lot of people experience multiple losses, and I wanted to speak to that unique experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, I lost my grandmom through COVID,
Yeah.
2 days, and she passed on. And even, I mean, this particular grandmother has been dying for over 20 years. Every time we see her, she's like, "Hey, this is the last time," and we're like, "No, you'll be fine." And the hardest part about that, I suppose, is the unique situation that you were talking about, and just to sort of give that a little bit of a voice at this moment. She, as like she's been dying for 20 years, like so she's prepared. She had a bag of what she wanted to be buried in and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
But because she had COVID, they didn't want to touch the body, and there was all this.
They couldn't honor
They
those
couldn't
things.
honor those things, which
Mm.
in which would have meant a lot to her, which kind of becomes this really crazy thing that we get caught up about. I get caught up in, my mom got caught up in, with is like, it's but with something that we couldn't change. uh but I suppose everyone is going through that kind of loss and that kind of different nuanced situations during when they lose someone. How, I mean, I know you mentioned in the book, but what would you give someone right now if they are like watching this and consuming this and maybe going through it silently? What are some of the thoughts that you'd like allow them to have, or maybe perspectives that could help them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out to me was the centrality of love in the presence of grief, right? Whenever we're grieving something, whether it's a person or the loss of a plan, the loss of a job, the loss of a dream, it's our love for that person or thing that then becomes the inverse of grief. So grief is sort of the shadow of love. And for some reason that I found that to be very comforting and helpful to sort of recognize like, oh, I'm in some pain because of the depth of love that I had for these family members. And that helped it to feel like difficulty with a purpose, right? Difficulty with meaning behind it. I also want to acknowledge that I think grief is really, really isolating for people. Even members of the same family who are affected by the same loss feel differently about it, process it differently. And so it can be a time where people feel really lonely. And I want to acknowledge that because I think it's sort of normal, and it can be a time of going very internal, kind of like a dark night of the soul, which is not pleasant to be in, but can have this transformational power if you listen to it, if you lean into it, if you sort of curiously notice what's there.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what? One of the first chapters in your book, I love this exercise about taking a moment to write down the timeline of your grief. I thought that
Yeah.
was just absolutely brilliant because it does. I mean, I majored in psychology, so I get some of the things that are happening in that one in that exercise because it's so it gets you out of your head in that vicious circle of what you make up, right? And just having it down as a timeline in facts is so powerful.
Yeah, it sort of takes it from being right in here and you can look at it out on the page in front of you.
Yeah.
I also think for most of us, it gives an appreciation for like, wow, I've been through some things.
Right.
Like, even this in the loss of your grandmother, like, there was a phone call, there was a day of waiting, there was many conversations with family members about what to do. And all of those pieces actually matter to how you feel about the story, not just the simple one line of like, my grandmother died of COVID.
Yeah.
So appreciating the nuance and the complexity, I think, can create some self-compassion. It's not about wallowing by any means, but it's about honoring the story.
Yeah. And just looking at the facts for what they are. I mean, I thought that was truly amazing, truly inspired, and for everyone listening, I recommend the chapter on how to talk to grieving people. It's only 6 pages long, and it is absolutely worth every word in here because a lot of us go through grief and we don't know how to deal with it when someone else is going through it. So what we do is we ignore it and we kind of make small talk. And this is such a good, it was only 6 pages, but it's so useful for someone that you can actually feel like you can help, as opposed to sometimes when someone's going through a hard time, you think that if you say something you might make it worse. And is that a normal feeling, or is that just sort of us trying to make ourselves feel give us an excuse or a way out to not sort of dealing with a difficult situation?
Oh, I think well-meaning people don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're greeting someone, say that we're getting together for some coffee and you sit down and you do the little small talk exchange and it's going well and no one's crying and no one's done this like spiral into grief. The tendency then is to say, okay, I'm not going to bring it up. Like, we're not going to talk about my dead dad or your dead grandmother. We're just going to like proceed. Like, what books have you been reading? What movies have you watched lately? Because I think we're afraid of introducing emotional complexity or potentially sadness into the story. When, let's be honest, it's not like we've forgotten about our dead loved ones. It's right there in the back of our minds.
Yeah.
We're not unaware. Um, and so I think it's sort of this weird misdirected compassion. You want to not upset someone, but in the end, I think we often end up like kind of ignoring or not honoring what they're living in. And so I think the best way to do that is to do it with a lot of choice, which is to say something like, "Hey, would you like to tell me a story about your grandmother?" Or, "Hey, I know you've just had this loss in your life. I would love to listen if you feel like talking about it." And so the permission that we give when we phrase things like that helps to restore a sense of choice, which
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah, yeah, and I love what you've done with this book. Thank you so much for writing it. I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like to actually go through some of the things. I can't actually imagine because I feel it when I read it. But I mean, I've not lost a dad or a sibling, and I feel immense sense of gratefulness that I didn't have to go through that yet. But I can only read what you've written here and imagine how hard it must have been when I constantly think about you as an inspiring figure, and I found out about the new podcast Mind Cure, and I find how is an academic getting into psychedelics, how is that working for you, and what is going through your mind when you're doing that?
All of the academics are doing it. I'm not new at all. So, literally, there are over 80 new centers of excellence at academic medical schools in the US that are focused on clinical research related to psychedelics. Places like Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical School, UC San Francisco, UCLA, like all of the all of the big names
Mm.
are really curiously exploring this new science about old tools that have, it looks like, very significant power to help alleviate a variety of mental health concerns. So I wish I could say I was like some novel cutting edge academic, but I'm not. I'm just kind of like on the bandwagon. And the reason I'm on the bandwagon is because the research is also really sound. There are an increasing number of really well done, robust clinical studies that point to the likelihood that psychedelics can be really, really helpful in alleviating PTSD, anxiety, addictive disorders, which are, actually very difficult to treat, and a whole host of other kind of mood and anxiety related issues.
And when you're doing this work, what is the most surprising sort of research you've come across? Because I don't know whether, for me, it was the first time in Park City that I was exposed to the idea of entrepreneurship and psychedelics in 2018, and I find that it's come leaps and bounds since then,
Yeah.
but it has changed my mind a lot along the way. What are some of the like research and some of the studies that have been done that absolutely, I mean, it blew my mind back then, and I'm sure there are new ones now, but what are the stuff that comes to mind for you with this, the results that we can see with psychedelics?
Yeah, one of my favorite studies to think about and talk about is a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so a very reputable journal, by a research team that was led by Robin Carthart Harris, who was at that time in London and is now at UC San Francisco. But the study compared SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are kind of the standard like medicine for depression. And SSRIs are very, very commonly prescribed. One of the challenges with SSRIs is that they narrow both edges of the emotion spectrum. So if you think about emotion as a spectrum, maybe you've got sad on one end and happy on the other end. SSRIs sort of bring in the edges in both directions.
Got it.
So the study compared psilocybin, which is the sort of active ingredient in magic mushrooms, compared that to SSRIs, and they found that psilocybin was effective at eliminating the depressive symptoms, like minimizing that depth of sadness that people with major depression were experiencing, without turning down the other end of the spectrum. So without compromising a sense of joy or happiness or pleasure. And the reason that I think that is so important is because it's that end of the spectrum of the emotional experience that really creates a lot of our catalysts to stay alive, to be creative, to really engage in our lives. And when we numb that out, I think we really put people at risk for suicide, and we put people at risk to not really flourish in their lives. So if there's something that we can do that helps people feel less depressed without losing their spark of joy, that is a really amazing innovation in mental health care from where I sit.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, just the reason I want to talk about all these things, I mean, grief, psychedelics, mental health, these are all topics that you've picked that are difficult to talk about. And I
Yeah.
wonder, how does the podcast fit into this? How does it help you get these conversations or get into these topics? And how does that layer into the business, which is, how is it useful for you to have a podcast while talking about these topics is the question, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think because my work, whether it's talking about mental health concerns or talking about psychedelics or talking about death, like those are all, as you're identifying, like sort of difficult conversations to have.
Mm-hmm.
You don't always know who to ask. Maybe you're curious about psychedelics, but like, do you ask your doctor? Like, where do you have that conversation? And so I think podcasting is a really lovely way for people to get information, hear ideas, hear personal experiences, hear stories and interviews. And they can engage, with privacy. They can engage on their own terms. Like you can, if I'm giving a talk about grief, like you can listen to 5 minutes. And then if you feel sort of overwhelmed by it, you just pause it and come back to it later.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that allows for this sort of titration, or it allows people to engage with difficult content on their own terms, which is really, I think, very respectful of the listener.
Yeah.
So, from a business perspective, though, certainly ZenFounder is a comprehensive body of work about entrepreneurship and mental health that doesn't really exist in other places. There are now, many podcasts that talk about mindset or mental well-being for entrepreneurs, but I was one of the first. And so this body of work really is the foundation that I stand on, which says I have a PhD, I have all of this training and all of this experience, and look, here's all of the things that I know and that I've been talking about for years and doing it in public. And I think that really creates, for my professional brand, it creates a sense of like esteem, or just an established narrative that I think has been really helpful for my business.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reps, right? It's like the amount of, like, you can go back and go 300 odd episodes, which is massive. And we know for a fact that right now there's only like under 500,000 podcasts with like that have published in the last 90 days. So active podcasts, when you're looking at active podcasts that
Mhm.
have 7 or more episodes and have published in the last 90 days, there's only like 400 and something odd thousand podcasts, as opposed to what people are talking about with the 4 million. And I think it gets more difficult to put work out there over and over again. Have you ever witnessed in your journey as a podcaster the need to stop, like the pod fade, as they call it, like I don't have any more energy to give to this right now and I feel like I need to stop for a while? Did you feel that?
I did, to some extent. So when all of this grief was happening for me, I just didn't have the level of like creative, extroverted energy. I felt pretty quiet and like I wanted to be pretty private.
Yeah.
So during that time, there was about a year where I went from a weekly episode publishing schedule to every other week. So I just gave myself a little more space. I also, during that period, I asked a couple people to step in and just guest host for me.
Yeah.
So, the podcast isn't only me. There's other people who stepped in during that time. And that's actually been really helpful
Yeah.
to just infuse the conversation with some different voices.
No, that's that's such a cool idea. I mean, I have so many friends that would happily co-host a show or host a show entirely. Like I never even considered that as such a brilliant idea. So let's talk about the things that the podcast has done, right? Obviously, it has gotten you this credibility, but also, the standing to kind of have another podcast, and there's obviously worth to having him. What are the results that you've seen from having it for in your world that maybe most people might not think about, or they think about, or maybe what are the case studies sort of that has happened as a result of you having these podcasts?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Mind Curious.
Mm.
So, Mind Curious is a project that is a partnership with Mind Cure, which is a psychedelics company based out of Toronto. They're actually not active anymore, sadly, but because I had been doing ZenFounder for so many years and had a style and, was well established, Mind Cure actually hired me to do Mind Curious. So it was my first like professional paid podcasting gig, which is pretty fun.
Yeah.
But, it yielded, because I had been doing it for so long, it just yielded this opportunity to jump into this new field that I was super, super interested in and have the ability to host those conversations.
Yeah, how brilliant. What I would love to do right now is sort of talk about the mistake that business owners make, which is not ID3 tagging their MP3 file. But what I'd love to ask you on the back end of that is some of the psychological tactics that you might have for getting us out of our own way to express ourselves and the things that really matter to us, and putting ourselves out there, I suppose, is probably one of those things, and how we can do that most effectively. All right, team. So one of the mistakes that we make as business owner podcasters, because we're usually business owners that are becoming podcasters and don't know all the tools and tricks and trades of the trade. So sorry. So we've compiled a list of mistakes that business owners make, and usually you can fix them just by reading them. If you want a whole list of that, go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com and you can get your copy. Today's mistake is number 66, which is forgetting to ID3 tag your podcast. I'm going to show you what that looks like if I can. Is that? Yeah. So you'll see my screen right now, hopefully. And this is what an a file and a file that's an audio file looks like when you just make an MP3 file. But what it should look like is something like this, which has an image. It kind of tells who the authors are and the copyright, the title, your show notes in it, the year it was recorded, and what part of the podcast it is and which podcast it is. So then when someone downloads your MP3 file, they get all the SEO details in there, and also it SEO searchable through the fact that you've ID3 tagged them. And this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that business owners make, primarily because they don't know that it can be done. So if that is you, Google ID3 tagging or send me a message, and we'll give you a training on how to fix that. Okay, so what I did promise the audience in the little thing is ideas and psychological tactics to get out of our way when we think about putting ourselves out there. And I feel like now more than ever, we've got to put ourselves out there and actually tell people what we care about. How can we do that most effectively, especially when we want to create impact in the world?
Yeah, I think the things that get in the way, of course, are our own self-doubt, the voices in our head that say, what you have to contribute isn't that interesting, or other people have already said this, or any number of like unhelpful, self-attacking kinds of thoughts. And I think one of the tactics that I find most important is this very simple mantra of it's not about you. And when you are, I know this one works for you too, Ronsley. We talked about it with your TED Talk. But I know that when you are in your own head, it's not often the place that's most helpful to you. So I think about someone, an individual human that I want to talk to about this idea that I have. Maybe it's a client who's struggling with a problem. Maybe it's a family member who's having a difficult time. And I really like envision that human in my head. And I imagine talking to them when I jump on the mic, so that it isn't really about me. It's about the service and the insights and the support that I provide to other people. And I think that helps me get out of my way enough to just sit down and do the work.
And do you prepare before you start off? What is it? Do you have a preparation routine, or do you kind of feel like you achieve flow from all the reps you've already done?
I definitely have an outline. So I usually have, if I'm doing a solo episode, I maybe have 3 points that I want to hit or 3 stories that I want to tell. So I have a framework before I start,
Mm.
but then I just kind of flow into it. Similar with an interview, I think you can really tell when someone has done thoughtful preparation with an interview. Now that I'm doing so many interviews right now, I can tell if people have read the book or not or whatever. So doing that thoughtful preparation, having a couple really clear, thoughtful questions is a great starting point. And then if you want to flow with it from there, great. Have that really authentic conversation, but balance that with some structure and preparation.
Yeah, yeah. Finally, before we wind this up, as a podcaster of almost 400 episodes now, what that's crazy, right? Do you feel the accomplishment of putting that out there? Is the first
I
question.
feel the gray hair.
Yeah, it is such a process, right? It's so many spinning plates to put a podcast out there. But what kind of tips you have for someone that is new to the world of podcasting and just starting out?
I think when I started, I felt like I had to follow a recipe. Like I looked at what other podcasters were doing and I felt like, oh, I need to have these like listicles or I need to have these really snappy interviews. And so much of my journey has just been finding my own voice and making it my own. And I wish I could have gotten there sooner. Um,
Mhm.
in a way, I wish I had paid less attention to what other people were doing outside of like technical competence and quality. I wish that I had just let myself speak the way that I speak and think the way that I think and ask the questions that I wanted to ask instead of feeling pressure to make it something that someone else was finding success with.
Mm.
So I think that's one thing, which would just be the freedom to be creatively who you are. And I wouldn't do it if it's not fun. Honestly, I really like doing it. And the joy of it has kept me going for so long. So if you can find your little joyful part of it, amazing. If it's not joyful for you, then I would probably spend your time doing something else.
Right. I mean, I feel like everything I have around me right now, from the relationships to the business and everything, is because I don't know, a decade ago I decided to start a podcast, and it has been this insane journey ride to meet people that I mean are extraordinary in and meet people with so much energy and joy for life, and in so much different frequencies, I suppose is the best way to put it. Like, I get an opportunity when I interview someone to borrow their frequency for a little bit, or to share
Mm.
that frequency and their energy for a little while. And I feel so blessed to be able to do that, because not many people allow that to happen, and I find there's such beautiful connection in that. So thank you for doing this. I would love to ask you where people can find you, where would you like people to connect with you, and what's coming up for Sherry.
Yeah. So you can find, I'm easy to find on the internet. I'm at Sherry Walling on Twitter and Instagram. And my new book is called Touching Two Worlds, and I have touchingtwoworlds.com, which has some cool videos and just background story about that book. I have another book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together, and then of course the podcast ZenFounder. So yeah, it's a lot.
No,
Um,
it's good. It's so good.
Coming up, though, I'm excited about doing an aerial arts, so think circus arts performance for TEDx Breckenridge in Colorado. So instead of a TED talk, I'm doing a TED aerial or an aerial performance, which I'm very very excited about that.
Wow. Could you give us some insight as to how you're preparing to engage with the audience through your performance?
Yeah, I this piece is really the non-verbal depiction of what I've learned about grief through the story that, you and I spoke about earlier. And so I'm not sure exactly how I will involve the audience, but it really is a conversation without words.
Oh,
And so I'm looking forward to trying to bring that to life for folks.
oh my God, you're such an artist. I'm gonna link in the show notes, which you can find, ladies and gentlemen, the full edited episode on Should I Start a Podcast. You can find it on your podcast platforms. But in the show notes, I'm gonna tag this beautiful video that you sent me, and I've been
Mm.
sending that video to a lot of people. And I love your work. I love you as a person and the way you show up. And thank you for
Mm.
constantly being a mentor to me, even though you don't really realize you are. Uh, Thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for indulging me in this experiment and having me having you on my show. Thank you.
It's been lovely to be on the same frequency with you for this hour. Thanks so much for sharing of your energy and enthusiasm and insight and beauty.
Thanks,
My
Sherry.
pleasure.